Mike Tyson stood frozen in the middle of the bustling airport terminal, his heart hammering in his chest. The laughter of the airport workers cut through the noise of the crowd, sharp and cruel. "Look at him, just like on TV, huh? Think he's a fighter, but look at him now," one of them sneered, not bothering to keep their voice low. The words stung as they slid through the air, aimed directly at him. Tyson's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. He had seen the worst of life, been to the deepest pits of pain, but never had he felt so small, so vulnerable. There was something about the way these strangers mocked him, as though he wasn't even human, that dug deeper than any punch he had ever taken in the ring. He tried to ignore them, telling himself to keep walking, but it was impossible. The cruel words kept coming. "You think you can just walk in here like you own the place, huh? How pathetic, Tyson. You're a joke, always have been." Every word was a knife to his pride. Every glance, a reminder of what he had become. Tyson was used to facing opponents in the ring, but this was different. These weren't punches or kicks. These were barbs aimed at his very soul. He felt exposed, like an animal in a cage, and he hated it. His fists clenched, his muscles tightening, every instinct in his body urging him to lash out. But something kept him frozen. Something deeper, darker, that made his legs feel as if they were glued to the floor. He was no longer the young, untouchable champion, full of strength and brimming with pride. That man was long gone. All of it, the fame, the accolades, the admiration, had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but a shadow of his former self. He had once stood tall, feared by all, but now, he was just a joke. A faded legend. The insults continued to rain down. He could feel the sting of each word, their mockery gnawing at him like a persistent pest. He could see their eyes, full of scorn, as they laughed at him, as if his entire existence was something to be ridiculed. One of them, a younger man with a smug grin, came closer, almost daring Tyson to react. "You used to be someone, huh? What happened to the great Mike Tyson?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Guess you're just another has-been now." Tyson swallowed hard, the bile rising in his throat. It wasn't just about the words. It was the way they saw him, how they dismissed him, as if he meant nothing. As if he was no more significant than a passing shadow. He had fought so hard to rise above it all, to prove that he was more than just a fighter. But in that moment, he couldn't escape the painful truth, he was nothing to them. His body felt heavy with the weight of the years, the battles, and the mistakes he had made. There was a time when he wouldn't have let anyone speak to him this way. He would have fought back, he would have shown them what it meant to mess with Mike Tyson. But now, with his career over and his life in tatters, all he could do was stand there, absorbing the blows. Lisa. The thought of her hit him like a ton of bricks. She had been his everything, his anchor. But that had been before the cancer. Before the lies, the betrayal, and the abandonment. Before the wreckage of his own decisions had torn their world apart. He had left her. He had chosen to walk away when she needed him the most, leaving her alone in a hospital bed, abandoned, rejected, while he sought comfort in the arms of another woman. He couldn't even bring himself to think of what she had gone through in those final months. Alone, broken, betrayed. And for what? For his own selfishness? For his inability to face his own demons? The workers in front of him didn't know any of that. They didn't know that Tyson's life was not just a story of fame and fortune, but one of loss, regret, and loneliness. They didn't know that the man they were mocking had already been through hell. But in that moment, Tyson realized something. It wasn't just their words that hurt him. It was the fact that he had let them win. He had allowed himself to be reduced to this, nothing more than a target for their cruel jokes. And deep down, he knew it was because he hadn't yet forgiven himself. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Tyson said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the workers falter. The younger worker, who had been the most vocal, raised an eyebrow. Who? Some washed-up boxer? Tyson didn't flinch. He straightened his back, refusing to let them break him any further. I'm Mike Tyson, he said, his voice now calm but unmistakably fierce. And let me tell you, I've fought far worse than you too. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The workers exchanged looks, suddenly unsure of the man standing before them. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Mike Tyson, huh? The disbelief in his voice was clear. He didn't seem to believe it, but the way Tyson stood there, unyielding, spoke volumes. Yeah, Tyson continued, his voice gaining strength, and I'm not here to entertain you. So if you've got something to say it, but don't expect me to take it lying down. The younger man backed off, the bravado fading from his face. The air around them seemed to shift, the mocking laughter now replaced with an uneasy silence. Tyson stood tall, not as the fighter he once was, but as a man who had finally found a shred of his own dignity again. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. For the first time in a long while, Mike Tyson felt something stir inside him, a flicker of defiance, a reminder that he was more than the mistakes he had made. That he had a right to be here, to stand his ground. And as he walked away from the workers, their mocking voices quieting behind him, Tyson felt something else, a small, but significant, victory. The road ahead would be long. The scars of his past, the betrayals and regrets, were not so easily erased. But in that moment, Tyson realized that he didn't have to be the man he had once been. He could be someone else, someone stronger, someone who would no longer let life or people like this tear him apart. Mike Tyson walked away from the group of workers, his steps firm and deliberate, though his mind was swirling. The sting of their words still lingered, but there was something else too, a small but powerful feeling of pride. They had tried to break him, to humiliate him, but he hadn't let them. As he made his way through the terminal, the harsh laughter still echoed in his ears, but with each passing step, the noise began to fade into the background. He knew he couldn't escape the past, but in that moment, he was determined not to let it define him. The humiliation, the rejection, the way others saw him, he could choose not to let it consume him. But the weight of his past was never far behind. He couldn't shake the memories of Lisa, her beautiful smile, her laughter that once filled their home. She had been everything to him, and yet, when she needed him most, he had failed her. He had walked away from the one person who had believed in him, the one person who had loved him unconditionally, and for what? For a fleeting moment of comfort with someone else? The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. His hands, still clenched into fists, relaxed as he reached the exit. The cool air of the outside world hit him, but it did little to soothe the storm inside. Tyson had spent so many years fighting, physically and mentally, yet it felt like the battles he fought within were far more brutal. The memories of Lisa haunted him, the quiet moments in the hospital where she had looked at him, trusting that he would be there for her. But he wasn't. He had left her, and he couldn't change that. All he had were the regrets, the empty spaces where he had once held her hand. But something inside him snapped. He had been a fighter for so long, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the most important fight, the fight for himself. He had abandoned Lisa, yes, but he had also abandoned the person he used to be. The man who had conquered the world inside the ring was now hiding from the world outside. He had buried his pride, his strength, beneath layers of shame, fear, and pain. But as the memory of their laughter echoed in his mind, a quiet realization began to form. It was time to stop hiding. Tyson took a deep breath and looked up at the sky, the gray clouds above reflecting the heaviness in his chest. The airport was a temporary escape, a place he couldn't run from the world he had built for himself. But the world outside, there, he had to face what he had done, who he had become, and most importantly, who he could still be. He walked to the nearest bench, his body weary from the weight of it all. He needed to rest, but more than that, he needed clarity. Tyson knew that if he was going to move forward, he had to confront his demons head-on. The truth was, the man who had walked away from Lisa wasn't the man he wanted to be. He had made his share of mistakes, countless ones, and had hurt the people he loved. But he couldn't undo any of it. What he could do was change the direction of his life, starting now. Sitting on the bench, his head in his hands, Tyson closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him. He had lost so much, his career, his legacy, and most painfully, Lisa. But he had to find a way to live with it. He had to find a way to forgive himself, because if he didn't, he would continue to spiral deeper into this hole of self-doubt and regret. He thought about her, Lisa, and how she had been there when no one else was. She had believed in him when the world had turned its back. And what had he done? He had abandoned her. For a fleeting moment of selfishness, he had shattered the woman who had given him everything. The guilt was suffocating, but there was no way to go back. All he had now were the memories and the hope that one day, perhaps, he could make amends with himself. Tyson stood, wiping the tears that had begun to form at the corner of his eyes. He didn't know if he would ever be able to make peace with his past, but he knew that he couldn't let it control him any longer. He had to find a way to forgive himself, to let go of the shame, and move forward. It wasn't just about redemption, it was about reclaiming his life. The workers in the airport hadn't known who they were mocking, and maybe that was the greatest lesson of all. They didn't know his story, the battles he had fought, the pain he had endured. But neither did he. He had lost sight of his own worth, his own strength, and now, in this moment, it was time to find it again. He had no answers, no easy way out. But as he walked away from the airport, his steps felt a little lighter, his heart a little steadier. For the first time in years, Tyson didn't feel like a man lost in his own failures. Maybe, just maybe, he could begin to forgive himself. Mike Tyson had spent hours wandering the streets, not knowing where his feet were leading him, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and regret. The weight of the past pressed on him with every step. His mind kept circling back to the same painful truth: he had abandoned the person who loved him most, the one person who had been there for him through it all. Lisa. He could still feel her warmth, still hear her voice calling out to him in his mind, but she was gone. And it was his fault. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement as Tyson found himself in a quiet park. The cool air seemed to clear his head, but the ache in his chest remained. He sat on a bench, staring at the empty space before him, lost in thought. He had made so many mistakes, so many decisions that had led him down a path of destruction. The man he had become was someone he barely recognized anymore. His career, once his pride and joy, had crumbled. His reputation had been tainted by his own actions, and the people who had once looked up to him now viewed him as a cautionary tale. The abuse, the battles, the public scandals, it all felt like a blur, a series of unfortunate events that had slowly chipped away at the person he used to be. But now, sitting in the quiet park, Tyson realized something. It wasn't the world's perception of him that mattered, it was his perception of himself. For years, he had allowed the voices of others to drown out his own. He had let his failures define him. The pain of losing Lisa, the guilt of betraying her, had eaten him alive. But the truth was, he hadn't just lost her, he had lost himself in the process. The man who had once been driven by ambition, by the desire to prove himself, had become a hollow shell of that person. He had forgotten what it was like to fight for something real. As he sat there, the evening sky darkening above him, Tyson's thoughts turned inward. He knew he couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring Lisa back or undo the hurt he had caused. But what he could do was change his future. He could stop running from the truth and face it head-on. He could choose to stop hiding from his own pain, stop numbing it with distractions, and start healing. The healing wouldn't come easily, he knew that. But it had to start somewhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from his manager, someone who had been with him through thick and thin. The message read, "Mike, we've got an opportunity. They want you to come back. It's a big deal. Let me know when you're ready to talk." Tyson stared at the message for a moment, the words lingering in the air. The idea of returning to the spotlight, of stepping back into the ring, had once been an exciting prospect. But now, it felt different. It felt like a desperate attempt to reclaim something that could never be fully regained. He had been chasing the idea of redemption for so long, thinking that a return to the world he once ruled would somehow fix everything. But now, he knew it wasn't that simple. What he needed wasn't another fight. What he needed was to fight for himself. He typed a quick response, his fingers moving with determination. "I'll talk to you soon, but right now, I need to focus on something else. I'll be in touch." He hit send and put the phone back in his pocket, standing up from the bench. The weight of the decision didn't hit him immediately, but as he began walking through the park, it started to settle in. He wasn't ready to go back to his old life. Not yet. He needed time to heal, to rebuild himself, to find the man he had lost somewhere along the way. Tyson didn't know how long it would take, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't running from the past anymore. He wasn't hiding from the shame. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't. He was finally facing the reality of his life, and for the first time, he felt like he had a chance to make things right. It wasn't about fame or glory anymore. It wasn't about the money or the titles. It was about something much more important, his own redemption, his own peace. And that, Tyson realized, was something that no one could take away from him. As he walked away from the park, the sounds of the city growing louder in the distance, Tyson felt a sense of quiet strength settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. And that, he thought, was the beginning of his true comeback. Mike Tyson continued to walk through the city, the cool night air brushing against his skin as he passed beneath streetlights that flickered to life one by one. The world around him seemed to move at a faster pace, but inside, everything felt strangely still. He couldn't shake the sense of both progress and loss, the weight of the past still clinging to him, even as he tried to distance himself from it. He had made the decision to not return to his old life, not yet, anyway. It wasn't just about fighting in the ring again, it was about confronting the man he had been and reconciling with who he had become. For so long, Tyson had been driven by the need to be feared, to be admired, to be the best. He had built his identity around his image, his power, his strength. But now, standing in the quiet night, it felt like that version of himself had evaporated. He was no longer just Mike Tyson, the boxer, the fighter. He was Mike Tyson, a man with a broken past trying to pick up the pieces of a future he wasn't sure he even deserved. His mind wandered to Lisa, the woman he had betrayed, the one person who had given him all her love, all her trust, only to have him walk away at the moment she needed him most. Her face haunted him, her eyes full of confusion and pain when he had left her behind. The guilt gnawed at him, he could never forgive himself for that. He could never erase the hurt he had caused her. But there was a realization that was beginning to settle in, like a small spark of light in the midst of his darkness. He couldn't fix everything. He couldn't undo his mistakes, and he couldn't change what had happened. What he could change, though, was his relationship with himself. As he sat down on a bench overlooking the city, Tyson pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the messages. The text from his manager was still there, waiting. He stared at the screen for a moment, but then quickly locked the phone again. The temptation to return to the world he had once known was strong, but Tyson knew that it wouldn't solve anything. Going back to the public eye, to the fame and the fights, wouldn't heal the wounds inside him. It wouldn't bring Lisa back. It wouldn't erase the feeling of abandonment that had followed him for so long. And yet, the desire for validation lingered, like a deep-rooted addiction. He had built his identity on the applause, the recognition, the adoration of others. But now, standing in the quiet of the night, Tyson felt like he was being forced to rebuild from the ground up. The truth was, he had never learned how to love himself. He had never learned how to find peace with the man he had become, and it was that lack of self-love that had led him down a dark path. But now, as he sat in solitude, he was beginning to understand, the love and respect he sought from others had to first come from within. He couldn't keep running from himself, couldn't keep pretending that he was someone he wasn't. Tyson closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over him. The sounds of the city, distant cars, the murmur of pedestrians, the hum of life, felt oddly comforting. He was part of this world, a small but significant piece of it. He wasn't just Mike Tyson, the boxer who had fallen from grace. He was Mike Tyson, a man who had been through hell, who had lost everything, but who was now finding the strength to rise again. And that realization, small as it was, felt like a victory. For the first time in years, Tyson didn't feel like he was losing. He didn't feel like he was spiraling further into the abyss. There was a quiet strength in him now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. He could forgive himself. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he could start. Tyson stood up and walked away from the bench, his steps slower this time, more deliberate. He didn't know where his journey would lead, but he knew one thing, it had to start with him. He had spent so many years chasing after things that didn't matter, fame, glory, validation. Now, it was time to chase something more meaningful, peace, redemption, and self-respect. As he made his way through the streets, Tyson felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him. He had a long road ahead of him. He had to find a way to make amends for his past, but more importantly, he had to find a way to rebuild the man he had almost lost forever. And for the first time, Tyson felt like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. Mike Tyson woke up the next morning to a world that felt different. The sun shone through his window, casting warm, golden rays across the room, but there was a coldness inside him that he couldn't quite shake. The past few days had been filled with reflection, with an unyielding desire to move forward, but each step felt heavier than the last. The memories of Lisa, the betrayal, the abandonment, they still haunted him. The road ahead felt uncertain, but he knew there was no going back. He made his way to a small cafe in the corner of the street, a place he often went when he needed to clear his mind. The barista behind the counter greeted him with a smile, one that seemed genuine, unlike the forced kindness he had encountered so many times in his career. It was a reminder of how much he had isolated himself from the world. He sat down at a corner table, his coffee steaming in front of him, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. His thoughts wandered back to the text from his manager, the tempting offer to return to the public eye, to fight again, to relive the glory days. But it wasn't the glory that Tyson needed. It was peace. He stared out the window, watching the world go by, the hustle and bustle of the city continuing without him. People walked by, oblivious to the man who had once been the center of attention, the man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. But that man was gone. He was no longer the fighter who sought validation from the crowd. He was just Mike Tyson, trying to rebuild himself from the ashes of his past. He had to face his mistakes, the pain he had caused, the way he had abandoned Lisa at her most vulnerable. And yet, there was something inside him that refused to let go of the shame. The guilt still clung to him like a shadow, following him wherever he went. He had walked away from the woman who had given him everything, and no amount of success or redemption could change that. But then, a thought flickered in his mind, a small but powerful truth. He had to forgive himself. If he didn't, he would never truly be free. The realization hit him like a wave. For so long, he had been running from the pain, from the guilt, from the mistakes that defined him. But what if he could let it go? What if he could stop letting his past control him? Tyson took a deep breath and picked up his phone. His hands were steady as he unlocked it and opened the messages. The one from his manager was still there, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He typed, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready for that yet. I need to focus on something more important. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of relief. It was a small step, but it felt like a monumental one. He was no longer running. He was no longer hiding. He was facing the truth, no matter how painful it was. Tyson sat there for a while, letting the weight of his decision settle in. There was no easy path to redemption, no quick fix for the years of mistakes he had made. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't continue living for the approval of others. He had spent too much of his life doing that, chasing after something that would never bring him true peace. He had to learn to love himself, to accept himself for who he was, flaws and all. He had to forgive the man who had made mistakes, who had hurt others, because without that forgiveness, he would never be able to move forward. The road ahead was still long, and the weight of his past would always be there. But for the first time, Tyson felt like he was ready to face it. Ready to heal, to rebuild, and to become the man he had always wanted to be. As he stood up from the table, he felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. The journey wasn't over, but Tyson knew he was no longer walking it alone. He had a long way to go, but with each step, he was reclaiming a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. And that, he realized, was the most important fight of all. Weeks passed, and Mike Tyson's journey of self-redemption continued. Each day felt like a battle against his past, against the guilt that never seemed to loosen its grip on him. But slowly, something changed. The darkness that had once swallowed him began to lift, replaced by small glimmers of light. He had stopped running, stopped seeking approval from others, and started focusing on his own healing. It was a painful process, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but it was his process. One evening, as he sat in his small apartment overlooking the city skyline, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something told him to answer. "Mike?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, unfamiliar. "Yes, who's this?" Tyson's voice was low, steady. "It's Lisa," the woman said softly. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to tell you something. Tyson's heart skipped a beat. The name hit him like a punch to the gut, but there was no rage in his heart, no bitterness, only an overwhelming sense of confusion. "Lisa. I didn't expect to hear from you." His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm sorry for what I did, for everything." "No, Mike," she interrupted, her voice strained. "It's not what you think. I'm not calling to tell you that I forgive you, or that everything's okay now. I'm not calling to reopen old wounds." Mike froze. His mind raced. Then, almost cautiously, he asked, "Then why? Why are you calling?" There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them like a rope pulled taut. Then, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "Because I wasn't the one who was hurt the most." Tyson's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" The truth is, Mike, the truth is, I'm not the one who suffered most from everything that happened. Lisa's words hit him with the force of a tidal wave. I don't even have cancer anymore. I was never sick. I never had it. I made it all up. I wanted to see how far you would go to prove you cared. I wanted to test you, to see if you'd fight for me, if you'd ever truly choose me. Mike felt as though the world had collapsed beneath him. His hands began to tremble as he tried to comprehend what she had just said. His chest tightened with disbelief, the truth sinking in like shards of glass. What? What do you mean? You? I wasn't sick, Mike, she repeated, her voice steady now, but there was an edge to it. I was manipulative. I pushed you away to see how much you would suffer, to see how much you'd hurt. And you did, didn't you? You suffered in ways I can never undo. And I realized. I never gave you a chance to truly prove your love because I never trusted you to begin with. Tyson was speechless. The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. The woman he had betrayed, the woman who had been the center of his pain, had done the same to him. She had manipulated him, used his love against him, and in doing so, made him believe he was the one who had destroyed everything. Lisa, Tyson's voice faltered, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the revelation. Why? She sighed deeply. I thought I was saving myself from being hurt, from being abandoned again, like so many times before. I pushed you away, but I didn't realize that in doing so, I pushed away the one person who truly cared for me. And when you left, I was left to face the consequences of my own actions. Tyson felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. He had spent all this time carrying the guilt of leaving her, thinking he had abandoned her at her most vulnerable, but now the truth was staring him in the face. He had been played, manipulated into believing he was the villain when, in reality, he had been a victim of her own fear, her own insecurities. There was a long silence before Tyson finally spoke, his voice a mix of disbelief and reluctant understanding. So, everything I thought I knew, everything I felt, it was all a lie? It wasn't a lie, Mike. I was sick, but not in the way you think. I was emotionally broken, and I pushed you away because I didn't think I deserved love. I pushed you to the edge, and when you left, I watched you suffer. I thought I'd get some sort of vindication from it. But in the end, all I did was destroy myself. The call ended abruptly, and Tyson was left alone, his heart heavy, his mind spinning. The world had been turned upside down. The pain he had been carrying for so long, the weight of his past mistakes, now seemed so trivial. The truth had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth nonetheless. For the first time in his life, Tyson realized the lesson that had eluded him for so long. You can't heal by carrying the weight of other people's mistakes. Lisa's call, her confession, shattered the final illusion Tyson had about himself and his past. It wasn't about him being the bad guy. It wasn't about him failing. It was about two people, broken in their own ways, using each other's pain to mask their own. And in the end, they had both lost. Tyson sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling in. He had been trying to heal, trying to fix himself, but in reality, he had been holding on to someone else's story. The pain of his past no longer had a hold on him, he wasn't the villain he had thought he was. And as for Lisa, she had her own journey to take, and it was no longer his responsibility to fix hers. The lesson was clear, healing begins when you stop carrying someone else's burden. And sometimes, the most painful truths are the ones that set you free. Mike Tyson stood up, his face a mixture of sorrow and understanding. The past was gone. The present was all that mattered now. And he had the power to shape the future, one step at a time. And so, he walked forward, his journey just beginning.